She dialed 911 through tears, but reached the Vampire King's private line instead. The ancient ruler froze at his obsidian desk. What he didn't know, the terrified voice begging for help belonged to the daughter he'd lost to adoption centuries ago, and now her mortal stepfather's violence had led her straight back to him. Lydia Martinez pressed her back against the bedroom door, her 19-year-old frame trembling as Marcus's fists hammered the wood like thunder. The smell of whiskey seeped through the crack beneath the door, mixing with her stepfather's slurred curses that had become the soundtrack of her nights. Her fingers fumbled with her phone, tears blurring the screen as she tried to dial 911, but panic made her clumsy, and the numbers swam before her eyes. She pressed call and held her breath, waiting for the familiar voice of a dispatcher to tell her help was coming. Instead, silence stretched across an ocean, then a voice like velvet and winter spoke in accented English. "Please," she whispered into the phone. "He's hitting me again. I need help." 3,000 miles away in the Carpathian Mountains, the Vampire King froze at his obsidian desk where ancient treaties lay spread like maps of forgotten wars. Alexander Drakul had ruled for 8 centuries, had commanded armies and bent nations to his will, but the voice crackling through his encrypted line made him feel mortal again. Time collapsed as her words echoed in the stone chamber where no mortal voice had ever reached. The musical cadence, the way she shaped her vowels, the desperate melody of her fear, it was Elena's voice rising from the grave. But Elena had been dead for 3 centuries, buried beneath wildflowers in a village that no longer existed, and this voice belonged to someone young and terrified and alive. The Vampire King's pale fingers traced the phone's surface as if he could reach through technology and time to touch the speaker. His mind raced through possibilities and probabilities while his dead heart performed the impossible act of breaking twice. Elena Martinez had been a nurse in a plague-ravaged village when he'd arrived wounded and desperate in 1723. She'd hidden him in her cottage's root cellar, changing his bandages by candlelight while vampire hunters prowled the streets above. Love had bloomed in that darkness like night-blooming Sirius, beautiful and doomed and brief. Their daughter had been born during the winter of the Great Plague, a child with Elena's dark eyes and his pale skin. But the vampire hunters had found them when spring came. Elena had died giving birth, her human body unable to sustain the half-vampire child that grew too quickly in her womb. He'd given the baby to a human family, a baker and his wife who'd lost their own infant to fever. The Vampire King had believed his daughter died within months, her vampire heritage too weak to sustain her, her human half too fragile to survive without supernatural strength. He'd grieved her as he'd grieved Elena, locking their memory in the deepest vaults of his heart, where even he could not reach them without bleeding. But now this voice, this impossible voice that carried Elena's inflections and his daughter's desperation, spoke across centuries of silence. Lydia sobbed into the phone as Marcus's voice grew closer, his threats more specific and violent. The Vampire King listened to every word while his supernatural hearing caught details no human could perceive. The rapid beating of her heart, the way her breathing hitched with fear, the strange undertone in her voice that spoke of power just beginning to wake. She was coming into her vampire heritage, he realized with shock that felt like sunrise burning through his veins. The child he'd thought was fully human, the daughter he'd believed was dead, was alive and manifesting abilities that would change everything. "Sir, are you there?" Lydia whispered, her voice smaller now as Marcus's pounding grew more violent. "I don't know who you are, but please, if you can hear me, I need someone to help me." The Vampire King closed his eyes and let himself feel the weight of 3 centuries of regret. "I hear you," he said, his voice carrying across oceans and through time. "Tell me where you are. I'm coming for you." Lydia gave him her address between Marcus's increasingly violent threats, her voice breaking as she described the stepfather who'd made her life a prison since her mother's death 5 years ago. The vampire king memorized every detail while his supernatural senses reached through the phone connection, tasting her fear and her strength, recognizing in her voice the echo of every lullaby he'd sung to Elena when she carried their child. The door splintered then, wood exploding inward as Marcus's shoulder finally broke through the lock Lydia had trusted to protect her. She screamed and the phone clattered to the floor as her stepfather's massive frame filled the doorway, his face twisted with alcohol and rage. "Get over here," he snarled, his words slurring together as he reached for her with hands that had left bruises on her arms too many times to count. The line went dead, leaving the Vampire King staring at his phone's screen where a Denver address glowed like a beacon calling him home. For 800 years, he'd ruled from his mountain fortress, commanding respect and fear from every supernatural creature in Eastern Europe. His word was law, his presence a force that could shift the balance of power between species. But now he stood slowly from his obsidian throne, his ancient bones moving with purpose they hadn't felt since Elena's death. Victor appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by thought, his lieutenant's pale face reflecting concern that bordered on alarm. "My lord," Victor said, his voice carrying the careful respect of someone who'd served the Vampire King for 4 centuries. "The council awaits your decision on the territorial disputes." The Vampire King moved past him toward the stairs that led to his private chambers, his steps echoing in the stone corridor like a death knell. "Cancel all appointments," he commanded without turning around. "Prepare my daylight protection and ready the jet. We leave within the hour." Victor's confusion was evident in his silence before he dared to question his master's orders. "My lord, the council meeting cannot be postponed. The Romanian coven threatens war if we don't respond to their territorial claims by dawn." The Vampire King paused at the base of the staircase, his hand resting on stone worn smooth by centuries of his touch. In the distance, wolves howled in harmony with the mountain wind, their voices carrying messages that only the ancient ones could understand. "War can wait," he said, his voice carrying finality that made even Victor step back. "My daughter is alive and she needs her father. Ready my daylight protection, Victor. I'm going to collect what belongs to me." The lieutenant's shock was visible even to mortal eyes, his carefully maintained composure cracking like ice in spring. "Your daughter, my lord, but she died centuries ago. We buried her memory with the woman you loved." The Vampire King turned then, his eyes blazing with light that hadn't burned there since Elena's death. "She lives," he said simply. "And for the first time in 300 years, I have something more important than a throne to fight for." Victor bowed deeply, recognizing in his master's voice the implacable will that had built their kingdom from blood and shadow. "As you command, my lord, the jet will be ready in 30 minutes." The Vampire King climbed the stairs to his chambers, where portraits of Elena lined the walls, her face captured in oils that had survived longer than empires. He touched the largest painting, his fingers tracing the curve of her smile, the gentle intelligence in her dark eyes. "Our daughter lives, Elena," he whispered to the painted face. "She has your voice, your courage. I won't lose her again." In a locked drawer, he found the locket Elena had worn, a simple silver piece that held her picture, the only photograph they'd managed to capture before the hunters came. He placed it around his neck and felt the metal warm against his cold skin. Then he opened another drawer and withdrew weapons he hadn't touched in decades, silver-lined daggers and ancient artifacts that could kill even immortals. If anyone stood between him and his daughter, they would learn why he'd earned the title of Vampire King through 8 centuries of blood and conquest. The private jet waited on the castle's landing strip as dawn approached, its engines humming with the power to carry him across an ocean in hours rather than days. Victor handed him a briefcase containing his daylight protection, amulets and artifacts that would shield him from the sun's deadly touch. The cost of using such items was enormous, each moment of protection burning through centuries of stored magical energy. But the Vampire King didn't hesitate. "My lord," Victor said as they boarded the aircraft, "what of the kingdom in your absence?" The Vampire King settled into the leather seat and watched the Carpathian Mountains fall away beneath him, peaks that had sheltered his kind for millennia growing small in the aircraft's windows. "Rule in my name until I return," he commanded. "If any challenge my authority, remind them that even kings have priorities higher than crowns." Victor nodded and settled across from him, his ancient features reflecting concern that went deeper than political necessity. "And if we're challenged by hunters, my lord, if they discover your presence in human territory, then they'll learn what happens when someone threatens my family," the Vampire King replied, his voice carrying the promise of violence that had made armies tremble. "I've spent 3 centuries believing my daughter was dead, Victor. Now that I know she lives, I'll move heaven and earth to keep her safe." The jet climbed toward cruising altitude as the sun painted the eastern sky with shades of gold and crimson. The Vampire King closed his eyes and felt the daylight amulet's power flowing through him like liquid fire, protecting him from the dawn that would normally reduce him to ash. The pain was considerable, each minute of sun exposure costing him dearly, but he endured it gladly for the chance to reach his daughter. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, as the jet carried him toward a reunion 3 centuries in the making, the Vampire King allowed himself to hope that love could indeed conquer time, distance, and the cruel mathematics of mortality that had stolen his family once before. The Vampire King's jet touched down at Denver International Airport as the first rays of dawn painted the Rocky Mountains gold and crimson, colors that would have been his death without the ancient amulets burning against his chest like captured starlight. Alexander Dracul stepped onto American soil for the first time in 2 centuries, his supernatural senses immediately assaulted by the cacophony of 6 million human heartbeats, the electric buzz of modern technology, and beneath it all, a familiar scent that made his dead heart clench with recognition. She was here, his daughter, somewhere in this sprawling urban maze that had grown like a concrete forest where once only prairie grass had whispered to the wind. Victor remained with the jet while Alexander commandeered a black sedan, the luxury vehicle's tinted windows providing additional protection as he navigated streets that pulsed with morning traffic. The address burned in his memory led him through neighborhoods that spoke of struggle, past houses where dreams went to die and hope survived on borrowed time. When he found the small ranch house with peeling paint and a dying lawn, the Vampire King parked 3 blocks away and approached on foot, moving through shadows that bent to accommodate him like old friends welcoming their master home. The house squatted on its lot like a wounded animal, its windows dark except for the kitchen where warm light spilled across cracked linoleum and revealed a scene that made 8 centuries of control evaporate like morning mist. Lydia stood at the stove, her back turned to him, but he could see the careful way she moved, the slight favoring of her left side that spoke of recent violence. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, Elena's hair, and when she turned to reach for a plate, her profile caught the light and showed him Elena's nose, Elena's chin, but his own pale skin and the delicate bone structure that marked her as something more than human. Bruises decorated her throat like a necklace of pain, purple and yellow fingerprints that made the Vampire King's vision go red at the edges. Marcus Hendricks lurked in the living room, his massive frame sprawled across a recliner that had seen better decades, empty beer bottles forming a constellation of failure around his feet. The man's thoughts leaked through his alcohol-soaked brain like sewage, crude fantasies about control and possession that made Alexander's fangs extend involuntarily. Every fiber of his being screamed for violence, for the satisfaction of watching this creature's blood paint the walls while he begged for mercy that would never come. But he forced himself to remain still, to watch and learn, because rushing in would only endanger the daughter he'd already lost once to his own mistakes. Lydia moved through the kitchen with unconscious grace, her body adapting to space and obstacles with reflexes too quick for pure humanity. She paused at the sink, her head tilting as if hearing something beyond normal perception, and Alexander realized she was listening to Mrs. Chen next door, tending to a paper cut. The scent of blood carrying 3 houses away on morning air that shouldn't have been able to carry such information. His daughter was awakening to her heritage, her vampire senses developing despite never knowing what she truly was. The sunlight streaming through the kitchen window made her skin glow with an inner luminescence that spoke of supernatural blood. But she pulled her sleeves down and moved away from the brightness, as if it made her uncomfortable. She didn't understand what was happening to her body, attributing the changes to stress and trauma. But Alexander could see the signs as clearly as constellations in a clear sky. Lydia plated scrambled eggs with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of controlling strength that was growing beyond human parameters. When she carried the plate toward the living room, Alexander caught sight of her face full on for the first time and nearly fell to his knees in the shadow of a dying elm tree. Elena's eyes looked back at him across 3 centuries, dark brown with flecks of gold that caught the light like captured sunshine. But the expression in those eyes was older than 19 years should have allowed, tempered by suffering that had aged her soul while keeping her face young. She set the plate on a TV tray beside Marcus's chair with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that any mistake could trigger violence. The man grunted something that might have been thanks, or might have been another threat, his attention never leaving the television where morning talk shows promised easy answers to complex problems. Alexander watched his daughter retreat to the kitchen, her movements economical and purposeful, and felt the weight of every year he'd missed crushing down on him like the pressure at ocean's deepest points. He should have looked harder, should have checked on the family that took her, should have known that his blood wouldn't let her die so easily. But vampire hunters had been closing in, and he'd been young then, only 500 years old and still believing that love was weakness rather than the greatest strength any immortal could possess. Now he understood that his daughter had survived, not despite her vampire heritage but because of it, her supernatural constitution, allowing her to endure abuse that would have broken a fully human child. The realization filled him with equal parts pride and rage, admiration for her strength and fury at the necessity that had forged it in fires of suffering no child should know. Hours passed as he watched from the shadows, learning the rhythm of her captivity. Marcus left for work at a construction site, his departure marked by shouted threats about dinner expectations and warnings about answering the phone or talking to neighbors. Lydia waited until his truck disappeared around the corner before allowing her shoulders to drop, before letting exhaustion show in every line of her body. She moved through the house like a ghost haunting her own life, cleaning and organizing with mechanical precision while her mind clearly traveled elsewhere. Alexander longed to approach her then, to reveal himself and sweep her away from this place that had become her prison. But centuries of strategic thinking held him back. She'd been conditioned to fear sudden changes, to expect violence from men who claimed to care for her. Rushing in would likely terrify her more than comfort her, and the last thing he wanted was to become another source of fear in a life already too crowded with threats. Instead, he followed her when she left for classes at community college, watching from carefully maintained distance as she navigated a world that didn't understand what she was becoming. Her professors treated her with the respectful distance reserved for students who worked too hard and smiled too little. Her classmates seemed to sense something different about her but couldn't articulate what it was, the way humans instinctively recognized predators, even when those predators wore friendly faces. Lydia sat alone during lunch, picking at a sandwich while reading textbooks that promised her a future beyond the house where hope went to die. The Vampire King noticed how other students gave her space without realizing they were doing it, how they responded to subtle cues that marked her as something other than fully human. She was beginning to manifest presence, the supernatural charisma that would eventually allow her to command attention and respect without conscious effort. But for now, it only served to isolate her further in a world where she'd already learned to expect nothing from others. When evening came, Alexander made his decision. He would approach her at work, in public where she might feel safer, where the presence of witnesses would reassure her that he meant no immediate harm. The Night Owl Diner squatted on East Colfax like a neon beacon for the desperate and displaced, its windows glowing against the darkness while inside, fluorescent lights hummed their electric lullabies over red vinyl booths and chrome fixtures that had witnessed decades of human drama. Lydia worked the evening shift, her uniform crisp despite her obvious exhaustion, her smile professional despite the bruises she'd tried to cover with makeup. Alexander entered the diner as the dinner rush was winding down, choosing a booth in her section where he could observe without seeming to stare. When she approached his table, notepad ready and pen poised, he looked up into Elena's eyes and felt time stop the way it had when he'd first heard her voice across an ocean of years. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice carrying that musical cadence that had haunted his dreams for 3 centuries. Her professional smile flickered slightly as their eyes met, confusion crossing her features, as if she recognized something familiar in his face, without understanding what it was. "Coffee," he replied, letting his accent color the simple word with old-world formality. "Black, please. And whatever you recommend for someone who hasn't eaten properly in far too long." His voice seemed to affect her the way hers had affected him, creating recognition without understanding, connection without explanation. She blinked slowly, her pen hovering over the notepad as if she'd forgotten how to write, then shook her head and smiled more genuinely. "The meatloaf's actually good tonight," she said, her voice warming despite herself. "And the pie's fresh if you want dessert. My name's Lydia. I'll take care of you." The Vampire King nodded gravely, understanding that she was offering more than standard customer service, that some part of her sensed the importance of this moment, even if she couldn't articulate why. "Thank you, Lydia," he said, savoring the sound of her name on his tongue after centuries of silence. "I'm Alex, and I have the feeling you take very good care of everyone who needs it." She brought him coffee in a thick white mug and stayed to pour cream, even though he'd asked for it black, some instinct telling her that this stranger needed tending more than efficiency. Alexander watched her work throughout the evening, noting how she remembered every customer's preferences, how she diffused tension with gentle humor, how she moved through the diner's chaos with grace that spoke of supernatural reflexes held carefully in check. Other waitresses complained about difficult customers in early mornings, but Lydia simply did her job with quiet competence that impressed even jaded regulars who'd given up expecting good service anywhere. When her shift ended at midnight, she emerged from the diner's back entrance with her purse clutched tightly and her keys threaded between her fingers like makeshift claws. Marcus's truck sat in the parking lot like a predator waiting for prey, engine running and windows down so his angry voice carried clearly in the crisp night air. "Where the hell have you been?" he shouted as she approached the vehicle. "I called the house 6 times and you didn't answer. You think you can just ignore me because I'm not there to keep you in line?" Alexander rose from the shadows where he'd been waiting, his supernatural hearing having caught every word of Marcus's tirade, his ancient heart breaking as he watched his daughter's shoulders hunch with familiar defeat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying enough subtle compulsion to freeze Marcus mid-rant. "I believe the young lady was working, not ignoring anyone. Perhaps you should speak to her with more respect." Marcus turned toward him with alcohol-glazed eyes and a face twisted by rage that had found a new target. "And who the hell are you?" he snarled, climbing out of his truck with the clumsy aggression of someone who'd never faced real opposition. "Some kind of knight in shining armor trying to rescue my stepdaughter from her responsibilities." The Vampire King stepped fully into the parking lot's harsh fluorescent light, letting his full presence manifest for the first time since arriving in Denver. 8 centuries of absolute authority rolled off him like heat from a forge, and Marcus suddenly found himself stepping backward without understanding why. "I'm someone who believes children deserve better than the adults who should protect them," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the primitive brain that still remembered when humans were prey. "You will go home now and sleep off whatever poison you've consumed. Tomorrow you will treat Lydia with the respect she deserves, and you will never again raise your voice or your hand to her. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes going glassy as vampire compulsion rewrote his immediate priorities and sent him back to his truck like a sleepwalker following familiar patterns. The engine started, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving Lydia staring at Alexander with confusion and gratitude warring in her expression. "How did you do that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with shock and relief. "He never listens to anyone, never backs down from a fight. What did you say to him?" The Vampire King reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card. Elegant black cardstock with silver lettering that seemed to shimmer in the artificial light. "I simply reminded him that bullies only understand strength," he said gently, pressing the card into her palm and closing her fingers around it. His touch sent electricity through both of them, recognition sparking between supernatural bloodlines that had been separated for too long. "If you ever need help, Lydia, call this number. Anytime, day or night. I'll answer." She looked down at the card, reading the single phone number printed beneath a name that meant nothing to her yet. "Alex Dracul," she said slowly, testing the syllables. "That's an unusual last name." "Romanian," he confirmed, watching emotions play across her face like clouds across the moon. "It means son of the dragon, a family name with a long history of protecting those who can't protect themselves." Lydia looked up at him then, studying his pale features and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know why you helped me, but thank you. Whatever you did, it worked. He's never just walked away from a fight before." The Vampire King stepped back into the shadows, his form already beginning to blur as supernatural stealth reasserted itself. "Everyone deserves someone who will stand between them and the darkness," he said softly. "Remember that number, Lydia. And remember that you're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more important than anyone has ever told you. Sleep well and dream of better tomorrows." He melted back into the night, like mist returning to the sea, leaving Lydia alone in the parking lot with a business card that felt warm in her palm and questions she didn't yet know how to ask. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The glass slipped from Lydia's fingers as she reached for the cabinet, tumbling toward the kitchen floor in what should have been an inevitable crash that would wake Marcus and bring his hungover wrath down upon her like a hammer blow. Instead, her hand moved with impossible speed, snatching the falling tumbler from mid-air before her conscious mind could even register the motion. She stood frozen in her small kitchen, staring at the glass in her trembling hand, trying to understand how she'd moved faster than thought itself. The morning sunlight streaming through the window made her skin crawl with uncomfortable warmth, and when she caught her reflection in the glass's surface, it seemed fainter than it should be, as if she were becoming transparent around the edges. Her appetite had changed too, the thought of her usual toast and coffee making her stomach turn, while an inexplicable craving for rare meat made her mouth water in ways that frightened her. She'd found herself standing in front of the butcher's display at the grocery store the day before, mesmerized by the deep red of fresh steaks until the concerned questions of the clerk had snapped her back to awareness. These changes were accelerating, becoming impossible to ignore or rationalize as stress symptoms from her deteriorating situation with Marcus. The business card Alex had given her seemed to burn in her pocket, his calm voice echoing in her memory with promises of answers she desperately needed. With shaking fingers, she dialed his number and felt relief flood through her when he answered on the first ring, his accented voice warm with concern that seemed too genuine for someone she'd just met. "Something's happening to me," she whispered into the phone, glancing toward the living room where Marcus slept off another night of drinking. "I'm changing in ways I don't understand, and I'm scared." Alex's voice remained steady and reassuring as he guided her through breathing exercises that somehow helped calm the supernatural energy crackling under her skin like captured lightning. "Meet me at the Skylark Cafe on Broadway," he said softly. "It's open all night, and we can talk without worry of being overheard." "I think I might understand what you're experiencing, Lydia. You're not going crazy, and you're not alone." The Skylark Cafe existed in that liminal space between night and morning, its neon sign buzzing against windows that had witnessed decades of secrets shared over coffee and pie. Alexander chose a corner booth where shadows pooled like spilled ink, his supernatural senses alert for any sign of danger, while his heart ached at the sight of his daughter's confusion and fear. She slid into the seat across from him, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug for comfort more than warmth, and began describing symptoms that confirmed his worst fears and greatest hopes. Her vampire heritage was manifesting rapidly, 3 centuries of dormant genetics awakening all at once in response to stress and proximity to her sire. He listened with the patience of eternity, while she spoke of impossible speed, fading reflections, and cravings that made no sense to her human understanding of biology. When she finished, he leaned forward with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal, his voice gentle with understanding, born from centuries of experience. "What you're describing sounds like a rare genetic condition that affects perhaps 1 person in 10 million, he said, the lie coming easily after decades of practice at hiding supernatural truths from human minds. I research such conditions, study families with unusual hereditary traits that medical science hasn't fully cataloged. Your symptoms suggest an ancient bloodline, something that might skip generations before manifesting under the right conditions." Lydia's eyes widened with hope that someone finally believed her, that her experiences weren't symptoms of mental breakdown but evidence of something real and explainable. Her questions came in a rush then, desperate inquiries about family history and genetic inheritance that forced Alexander to walk carefully between truth and necessary deception. She revealed that she was adopted, her birth parents unknown quantities in the mathematical equation of her existence. Her adoptive mother, Maria Martinez, had died when Lydia was 14, leaving her with Marcus Hendricks, a man who'd married Maria for her life insurance money and treated his stepdaughter like an unwelcome burden ever since. As Alexander listened to her story, pieces of his own past began falling into place, like puzzle fragments finding their proper positions. Maria Martinez could have been the baker's wife who'd taken his infant daughter, the kind woman who'd promised to love her as her own child. The timeline matched, the location was right, and the name Maria was close enough to Elena that it might have been chosen as tribute to his lost love. His daughter had lived within a few 100 miles of where he'd left her, growing up without knowledge of her true heritage, while he'd mourned her as dead for 3 centuries. The irony was cruel enough to make even an immortal laugh, if laughter hadn't been impossible around the choking weight of regret. Over the following nights, they met regularly at the Skylark, their conversations weaving carefully between Alexander's edited truths and Lydia's growing trust. He taught her meditation techniques that were really vampiric control exercises, showing her how to channel her emerging supernatural strength into manageable outlets. He spoke of ancient families with unusual gifts, of bloodlines that carried power through generations like genetic memories, waiting for the right moment to wake. She absorbed his lessons with the desperate hunger of someone who'd finally found answers to questions she'd been afraid to ask, her quick intelligence grasping concepts that would have taken others months to understand. Unknown to both of them, Dr. Elena Reyes had been tracking the subtle signs of supernatural activity that rippled through Denver like stones thrown into still water. Elena was fourth-generation hunter, trained from childhood to recognize the patterns that marked vampire presence in human cities. The unusual animal attacks that could be explained as feeding, the electronic interference that followed powerful immortals, the way crime statistics shifted when predators older than civilization moved through human populations like sharks through schools of fish. Her equipment had detected massive supernatural energy signatures centered around the university area, readings that suggested something ancient and powerful had taken up residence in her city. She staked out the locations where the signatures were strongest, photographing anyone who showed the telltale signs of vampiric influence. When her cameras captured Alexander entering the Skylark Cafe, she felt the cold recognition of prey finally revealing itself. His face triggered every alarm in the Hunter database, centuries-old sketches and paintings that marked him as one of the most dangerous creatures to ever walk the earth. Alexander Drakel, the vampire king of Eastern Europe, destroyer of armies and architect of supernatural treaties that had kept the species hidden from human awareness for almost a millennium. The fact that he was operating openly in American territory meant either catastrophic breakdown in supernatural law or something so important that even kings would risk exposure to claim it. Elena began documenting his movements, noting his repeated visits to the diner where a young waitress worked, tracking their midnight meetings at the Skylark with growing understanding of what she was witnessing. The girl showed signs of emerging vampiric traits, her movements too fluid for pure humanity, her presence affecting other customers in subtle ways that spoke of supernatural charisma beginning to manifest. Elena realized she was watching the awakening of new vampire, possibly one of royal bloodline, if Alexander himself was involved in her training. The hunter's duty was clear: eliminate both threats before they could establish permanent presence in human territory. But something held her back from immediate action. Marcus Hendricks had noticed changes in his stepdaughter too, but interpreted them through the lens of suspicion and control that colored all his interactions with the world. The compulsion Alexander had placed on him was wearing thin, supernatural influence fading as distance and time weakened its hold on his alcohol-soaked consciousness. He began following Lydia again, watching her leave for mysterious appointments that she refused to explain, noting how she moved with new confidence that threatened his carefully maintained dominance over her life. His paranoid mind conjured explanations involving drugs, or boyfriends, or social workers, any threat to the financial arrangement that kept him housed and fed through her inheritance fund. The confrontation came on a Tuesday night as Lydia walked home from her shift at the diner, her mind still processing the lessons Alex had taught her about controlling her emerging abilities. Marcus stepped out of the shadows near their house, his bulk blocking her path while his voice carried the dangerous edge that had terrified her throughout adolescence. "You think I'm stupid," he snarled, his breath reeking of whiskey and broken dreams. "Think I don't notice you sneaking around, meeting with strange men, coming home with ideas above your station? Well, I got news for you, little girl. You belong to me until you turn 21 and get that inheritance, and I'm not letting some con artist fill your head with fantasies about running away." He grabbed her arm with the casual violence that had marked their relationship since her mother's death, his fingers digging into flesh that should have bruised but didn't, strength that should have overwhelmed her but felt manageable now. Lydia tried to pull away with what she thought was normal force, the same resistance she'd shown hundreds of times before, but her vampire strength had been growing stronger each day under Alex's careful guidance. Marcus flew backward as if launched from a catapult, his 200-pound frame sailing 20 feet across the parking lot before crashing into a dumpster with force that dented metal and sent garbage cascading across cracked asphalt. Elena Reyes watched from the shadows of a nearby building, her camera capturing every moment of the supernatural display, while her hunter's mind cataloged the implications of what she'd witnessed. The girl's strength was already beyond human parameters, her reflexes showing the enhanced coordination that marked advanced vampiric development. More importantly, her reaction to accidentally hurting Marcus suggested she retained human empathy and conscience, traits that usually disappeared as vampires matured into their predatory nature. Lydia stood frozen over Marcus's groaning form, her hands shaking as she realized the impossible thing she'd just accomplished. He was twice her size and had been using physical intimidation to control her for 5 years, but she'd thrown him aside like a rag doll without conscious effort. The strength flowing through her limbs felt alien and terrible, power she'd never asked for and didn't know how to control. Marcus struggled to his feet with obvious pain, his face pale with shock and something that might have been fear for the first time since she'd known him. "What the hell are you?" he whispered, backing away from her with wide eyes that reflected the parking lot's harsh fluorescent lighting. "What kind of freak did Maria bring into my house?" Lydia fumbled for her phone with trembling fingers, calling the number she'd memorized as her lifeline to sanity in a world gone mad. Alex answered immediately, his voice sharp with concern that suggested he'd been expecting her call. "I heard him," she whispered into the phone while Marcus retreated to his truck like a wounded animal seeking familiar shelter. "I didn't mean to, but I threw him across the parking lot like he weighed nothing. I'm scared, Alex. I'm scared of what I'm becoming." From her surveillance position, Elena Reyes listened to every word through directional microphones that captured conversations from impossible distances, her hunter's training warring with unexpected sympathy for a girl who clearly didn't understand her own nature. The Vampire King's presence in Denver was no longer a mystery. He'd come for his progeny, and Elena found herself witnessing a reunion 3 centuries in the making. The Night Owl Diner's parking lot had become a battlefield where 3 worlds collided with the force of inevitable destiny, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across a scene that would reshape the balance between species. Alexander arrived to find his daughter standing over Marcus's unconscious form, her hands shaking with the realization of her own supernatural strength, while Dr. Elena Reyes emerged from the shadows with a silver-tipped crossbow aimed directly at his heart. The hunter's voice cut through the night air with professional authority, tempered by genuine confusion, as she demanded answers from the Vampire King who'd brought chaos to her carefully ordered world. "Don't move," she commanded, her weapon trained on Alexander, while her dark eyes flicked between him and Lydia with calculating precision. "I know who you are, Alexander Dracul, and I know what you've done to this girl. The question is whether I kill you both now or give you 30 seconds to explain why the most dangerous vampire in existence is creating progeny in my city." Lydia stumbled backward, her mind reeling from the word vampire spoken with such casual certainty, the implications crashing over her like tsunami waves that swept away everything she'd believed about reality. "Alex," she whispered, her voice breaking on the name that had become her anchor in a storm of impossible changes. "What is she talking about?" "You said I had a genetic condition, that there was a medical explanation for everything that's been happening to me." The Vampire King stood perfectly still between the 2 women, centuries of strategic thinking compressed into split seconds as he weighed options that could determine not only their survival, but the future of supernatural secrecy itself. Elena Reyes was 4th-generation hunter, trained from birth to kill his kind without hesitation or regret, but something in her posture suggested uncertainty that might be exploited. His daughter needed truth more than protection now, her awakening vampire nature demanding answers that could no longer be hidden behind gentle lies and medical terminology. The crossbow's silver tip gleamed with lethal promise, while Elena's finger rested on the trigger with the steady pressure of someone who'd killed before and would kill again without losing sleep. "You have questions, Dr. Reyes," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying the diplomatic authority he'd learned through 8 centuries of supernatural politics. "And you, my dear Lydia, deserve answers that I should have given you from the beginning. Perhaps we can find truth that serves all our interests, without unnecessary bloodshed in a parking lot where human police might arrive at any moment." Elena's laugh held no humor, only the bitter recognition of irony that had shaped her entire existence. Truth from a vampire king whose very survival depends on lies and manipulation? You'll forgive me if I find that hard to believe. But you're right about the police, so speak quickly before I decide that eliminating you both is worth the complications it might create. Alexander reached slowly into his jacket, his movements telegraphed clearly to avoid triggering Elena's reflexes, and withdrew an antique silver locket that had survived longer than empires. The chain caught the parking lot's harsh light as he opened it to reveal a miniature portrait painted on ivory, a woman's face captured with the loving detail that spoke of profound devotion. Lydia gasped as she recognized the features she'd seen in faded photographs her adoptive mother had treasured. The same dark eyes and gentle smile that had watched over her childhood from a frame beside her bed. "This is your mother," Alexander said softly, his ancient voice heavy with centuries of grief held carefully in check. "Elena Martinez, a nurse who saved my life in 1723 when vampire hunters had left me wounded and dying in a plague-ravaged village. She was human, mortal, beautiful beyond description, and foolish enough to fall in love with a creature who could offer her nothing but danger and heartbreak. I am a vampire, Lydia, and that makes you my daughter, born of a love that defied every law of nature and supernatural politics." Elena Reyes felt her world shift on its axis as pieces of a puzzle she'd been assembling for years suddenly clicked into place with terrible clarity. "Elena Martinez," she breathed, lowering her crossbow slightly as memory flooded through her consciousness like water through a broken dam. "My great-aunt Elena, the family legend, the nurse who disappeared during the plague years and was never seen again. My grandmother told stories about her sister who fell in love with a mysterious stranger and died in childbirth bearing his child." The hunter and the hunted stared at each other across 20 feet of cracked asphalt while Lydia struggled to process revelations that rewrote her understanding of identity, family, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. "You're telling me that I'm half vampire?" she said slowly, her voice steadier than she felt as supernatural strength flowed through her veins like liquid starlight. "That my mother was your great-aunt, which makes us cousins of some kind, and that my father is the vampire king who our family has been hunting for 4 generations. The irony is rather poetic," Alexander observed with grim humor that held no joy. "Elena Martinez died bringing our daughter into the world, her human body unable to sustain a child whose very existence challenged the boundaries between species. I gave that child to a human family, believing she would live a normal mortal life, never knowing that vampire blood would call to her across centuries of dormancy. I thought you were dead, Lydia. I mourned you as I mourned your mother, and for 300 years I carried that grief like a stone in my chest where a heart should be." Elena Reyes found herself caught between duty and blood, between the training that demanded she eliminate supernatural threats and the family loyalty that recognized Lydia as innocent victim rather than willing monster. Her crossbow wavered as she struggled with implications that stretched far beyond simple questions of good and evil. "If what you're saying is true," she said carefully, "then this girl is family, and I've spent my entire career hunting the creature who loved my ancestor enough to risk everything for her. But that doesn't change what you are, Vampire King, or the threat you represent to human civilization." Alexander stepped closer to his daughter, his protective instincts overriding diplomatic caution as he saw shock and confusion warring in her dark eyes. "Lydia," he said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but you must understand that everything you've experienced, the speed, the strength, the enhanced senses, these are gifts of your heritage awakening. You are not becoming a monster. You are discovering what you were always meant to be. A bridge between worlds, possessing the best qualities of both human and vampire nature." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the night air like silver blades, growing closer with each passing second as someone had apparently called police about the disturbance in the parking lot. Elena cursed under her breath, recognizing that human law enforcement would complicate an already impossible situation beyond any hope of quiet resolution. "We can't stay here," she said, her hunter's pragmatism overriding emotional confusion as training took precedence over personal feelings. "If police arrive and start asking questions, it puts all of us at risk. Supernatural secrecy exists for good reasons, and exposure would be catastrophic for both our species." Alexander nodded agreement while helping his daughter process revelations that had shattered her worldview like glass striking stone. "My hotel suite has privacy protections and soundproofing that will allow us to speak freely without worry of surveillance or interruption. I propose a temporary truce, Dr. Reyes. Allow me to explain fully how I came to love your great-aunt, why I gave up our daughter, and why I've returned now to protect her from forces that neither of us can face alone." Elena holstered her crossbow with reluctant acceptance of necessity, her hunter's instincts screaming warnings even as family obligation demanded she listen to the Vampire King's story. "1 hour," she said firmly, her voice carrying authority that had been trained into her bones since childhood. "You get 1 hour to convince me that you deserve to live, that she deserves to live, and that letting you both disappear into the night serves something greater than my duty to eliminate supernatural threats. Then I make my decision based on facts, rather than family sentiment." They moved through Denver's sleeping streets like shadows cast by different light sources, three figures bound together by blood and circumstance navigating between worlds that existed in uneasy parallel to human awareness. The Vampire King's hotel suite occupied the penthouse of a building that catered to clients who valued privacy above luxury, its windows tinted to block sunlight, and its walls lined with materials that defeated electronic surveillance. Alexander poured brandy that was older than the United States, while Elena examined the suite for hidden threats and escape routes with professional thoroughness. Lydia sat carefully on expensive furniture that felt alien after years of secondhand poverty, her mind struggling to reconcile the elegant stranger who claimed to be her father with the terrifying figure Elena had described as the most dangerous vampire in existence. When Elena finished her security sweep and accepted that no immediate ambush awaited her, she settled into a chair positioned to cover both exits while keeping weapons within easy reach. Alexander sat across from his daughter, studying her face for signs of the woman he'd loved and lost 3 centuries ago, finding Elena Martinez's gentle strength reflected in features that carried his own supernatural heritage. The story he told them stretched across decades of plague and war, vampire politics and human persecution, love that transcended species boundaries and choices made in desperate circumstances that shaped the fate of generations. Elena Martinez had been 26 when they met, a nurse whose dedication to healing had kept her in a plague-ravaged village long after wiser souls had fled to safety. Alexander had arrived wounded by silver weapons and weakened by blood loss, seeking shelter from hunters who'd tracked him across half of Europe with determination born from religious fervor and personal vendetta. She'd hidden him in her cottage's root cellar, changing his bandages by candlelight, while death stalked the streets above in forms both natural and supernatural. Love had grown between them slowly, built on conversations conducted in whispers and touches that carried healing rather than violence. She'd known what he was from the beginning, had seen his fangs extend when pain overwhelmed his control, but her healer's instincts had recognized something beyond the monster that folklore painted in blood and shadow. Their affair had lasted one winter, 3 months stolen from a world that would have killed them both, for daring to love across species lines that had been drawn in centuries of mutual hatred and fear. When spring came and brought vampire hunters closer to their hiding place, Elena Martinez had been carrying their child, a pregnancy that progressed with supernatural speed, but threatened her human physiology with complications no mortal doctor could understand or treat. She'd died bringing Lydia into the world on a night when snow fell like tears from heaven, her last words a plea that their daughter be given a chance at normal human life, away from the supernatural world that had claimed too many innocent victims already. Alexander had honored that dying wish by giving the infant to Maria and Carlos Martinez, distant cousins who'd lost their own child to plague and were willing to raise Elena's daughter as their own flesh and blood. He'd believed the vampire heritage would prove too weak to manifest in a child raised purely human, that mortality would claim her within decades and spare her the burden of existing between worlds that could never truly accept her. Elena Reyes listened to the Vampire King's story, with growing understanding of family history that had been passed down through generations as cautionary tales and fragments of truth wrapped in legend. Her great-aunt Elena had indeed disappeared during the plague years, and family stories had always suggested romance with a mysterious stranger who'd vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared. The timeline matched perfectly with Alexander's narrative, and the photograph in his locket showed the same face that gazed from family portraits spanning 4 generations of hunters who dedicated their lives to eliminating creatures like him. Meanwhile, Marcus Hendricks had awakened in the parking lot with a concussion and memories that made no sense according to any rational understanding of physics or human capability. His stepdaughter, the girl he'd been intimidating and controlling for 5 years, had thrown him 20 feet with casual ease that defied every law of nature he thought he understood. Confused and frightened, he'd stumbled home and called police with a story about kidnapping and cult activity that would bring unwanted attention from authorities who asked uncomfortable questions about bruises and financial arrangements that looked suspicious under official scrutiny. Elena warned them that law enforcement involvement would create complications beyond simple arrest warrants or missing person reports, that human police operated with bureaucratic persistence that could expose supernatural secrets to government agencies equipped to turn isolated incidents into systematic persecution of entire species. The dawn brought chaos riding on wings of desperation and greed as Marcus Hendricks paced his empty house with the manic energy of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed in a single night. His head throbbed from the concussion Lydia's impossible strength had given him, but physical pain paled compared to the financial terror that gnawed at his guts like acid. Without his stepdaughter under his control, the monthly insurance payments that funded his drinking and gambling would disappear, leaving him destitute and homeless when her 21st birthday arrived in 6 weeks and transferred her full inheritance beyond his reach forever. The bruises covering his ribs served as painful reminders that the meek girl he'd been intimidating for 5 years had somehow become something dangerous and unpredictable. But Marcus's alcohol-soaked brain could only process threat in terms of lost revenue, rather than supernatural awakening. He called his brother Jake with the frantic urgency of a drowning man reaching for driftwood, spinning a tale of kidnapping and cult recruitment that painted Lydia as an innocent victim rather than willing participant in her own disappearance. Jake Hendricks operated on the margins of Denver's criminal underworld, running a crew of methamphetamine dealers and petty thieves who specialized in intimidation and violence for hire. The promise of splitting Lydia's inheritance once they dragged her home appealed to his mercenary instincts more than fraternal loyalty, and within hours he'd assembled a search team armed with handguns and baseball bats who prowled the city's streets with the systematic brutality of predators hunting wounded prey. Meanwhile, Dr. Elena Reyes had spent the sleepless night wrestling with conscience and duty, while encrypted communications flowed between her secure phone and Hunter command centers scattered across 3 continents. Her report of Alexander Dracul's presence in American territory had triggered response protocols that hadn't been activated since the vampire wars of the 18th century, when supernatural conflicts had threatened to expose both species to human governments equipped with weapons that could exterminate entire populations without regard for innocence or guilt. The Hunters' Council responded with chilling efficiency, dispatching a strike team led by Commander Sarah Cross, a woman whose reputation for eliminating high-value targets had earned her legendary status among those who dedicated their lives to maintaining the balance between human and supernatural worlds. Cross arrived in Denver aboard a military transport disguised as private jet, her team equipped with silver ammunition, ultraviolet weapons, and explosive devices designed to level city blocks, if necessary to prevent vampire royalty from establishing permanent presence in North American hunting territories. The orders were explicit and non-negotiable. Eliminate Alexander Dracul, regardless of collateral damage or political consequences, because allowing a vampire king to operate freely on American soil would shatter centuries of carefully maintained treaties that kept supernatural predators contained within designated boundaries. Elena found herself caught between family blood and professional obligation as she watched her colleagues prepare for a war that would claim her newly discovered cousin as acceptable casualties in service of greater good. The Hunter's encrypted phone buzzed with updates from surveillance teams that had identified the hotel where Alexander had taken Lydia. Tactical assessments that treated the girl as hostile combatant rather than confused teenager struggling to understand her own nature. Commander Cross made it clear that Elena's personal connection to the targets was considered a liability that might compromise mission success, suggesting strongly that she remove herself from active operations before emotional attachment led to tactical errors that could cost lives and expose Hunter operations to unwanted scrutiny. Alexander sensed the tightening noose of enemies converging from multiple directions as his supernatural awareness detected surveillance teams positioning themselves around the hotel like chess pieces moving toward inevitable checkmate. Victor contacted him from Europe with increasingly urgent reports about territorial challenges erupting across his kingdom as rival vampire lords tested boundaries they'd respected for centuries, probing for weakness in leadership that might provide opportunities for conquest and expansion. The Vampire King faced an impossible choice that would define not only his own fate, but the future of thousands of supernatural beings who depended on his strength to maintain order in a world where chaos meant exposure and extinction. Abandoning his throne to protect one daughter, even beloved daughter, would violate every principle of leadership that had sustained vampire civilization through millennia of human persecution and internal warfare. Yet the thought of losing Lydia again, of watching her die because he'd chosen duty over love, made his ancient heart clench with pain that transcended physical sensation and entered realms of spiritual agony he'd thought himself incapable of experiencing. The warehouse district east of downtown Denver provided temporary sanctuary among abandoned buildings where homeless populations and urban decay created natural camouflage for those seeking to avoid official attention. Alexander had purchased the entire facility through shell companies decades earlier, one of hundreds of safe houses scattered across the globe where vampire royalty could retreat when political necessity demanded strategic withdrawal from public scrutiny. The building's industrial architecture provided multiple escape routes, while reinforced concrete walls offered protection against conventional weapons and electronic surveillance systems that might betray their location to enemies approaching from multiple vectors. Lydia sat on a shipping crate in the warehouse's cavernous interior, her newly awakened vampire senses overwhelmed by the layered scents and sounds of urban decay that spoke of violence and desperation in languages her human upbringing hadn't prepared her to understand. She could hear Jake Hendricks and his crew searching abandoned buildings 6 blocks away, their crude voices carrying clearly through night air while they kicked down doors and terrorized homeless camps with questions about missing girls and mysterious strangers. The sound of her step-uncle's brutality made her stomach turn with recognition of family patterns that extended beyond Marcus's individual pathology into generational cycles of violence and exploitation that treated vulnerable people as disposable resources. Elena Reyes paced the warehouse perimeter with military precision, while monitoring encrypted communications that detailed strike team movements and tactical preparations designed to transform their sanctuary into killing ground. Her phone buzzed constantly with updates from command, pressure to withdraw from the area. Before combat operations commenced, reminders that her duty to humanity outweighed personal feelings for targets who represented existential threats to species survival. The hunter found herself questioning loyalty to organizations that had defined her identity since childhood, wondering whether justice always aligned with orders from superiors who viewed complex situations through lens of strategic necessity rather than human cost. The revelation came as Elena stopped pacing and turned to face Alexander with expression that combined professional assessment with personal pain that had been festering for generations like untreated wound. "You want to know why my family has been hunting vampires for 4 generations," she said quietly, her voice carrying weight of inherited grief that had shaped entire bloodlines' destiny. "It's not just professional duty or species protection, Vampire King. It's revenge for what you did to Elena Martinez, my great-grandmother's sister, the woman whose murder started a blood feud that's defined my family's purpose for over 3 centuries." Alexander felt ancient memories resurface like long-buried corpses clawing their way from graves he'd thought were sealed forever. Recognition dawning as Elena's family connections became clear through lens of accumulated pain and inherited trauma. "Your great-grandmother would have been Elena's sister Maria," he said slowly, his voice heavy with understanding that reframed every interaction they'd shared since meeting in the diner's parking lot. "The girl who blamed me for Elena's death, who swore on her grave that my kind would pay for stealing her sister's life and future. I remember her standing beside Elena's grave, screaming curses in Spanish while I tried to explain that love rather than violence had brought us together, that her sister had died bringing beauty into a world too dark to deserve such gifts." Elena's laugh held no humor, only bitter recognition of irony that had driven 4 generations of her family to dedicate their lives to eliminating creatures like the man who sat before her with grief etched into features that had witnessed centuries of loss and regret. Maria told her children that a monster had seduced and murdered her sister, that Elena Martinez had died because she'd been too innocent and trusting to recognize evil when it wore a beautiful face and spoke with elegant words. Those children grew up to become the first generation of organized vampire hunters in our family, training their own children to continue the war against creatures who steal human lives for their own selfish purposes. My grandmother, my mother, myself, we've all carried that mission forward, believing we were honoring Elena's memory by preventing other families from suffering the same loss. The warehouse's industrial lighting cast harsh shadows across 3 figures whose lives had been shaped by events that occurred before any of them were born, destiny written in bloodlines and trauma, that transcended individual choice or rational decision-making. Lydia listened to family history she'd never known existed while struggling to reconcile the loving mother in her adoptive family's photographs with the woman whose death had sparked generations of supernatural warfare. Alexander faced the impossible task of convincing Elena that love, rather than predation, had motivated his relationship with her great aunt, that grief rather than guilt had haunted him through centuries of self-imposed isolation from the human world he'd learned to fear would never understand the depth of connection possible between species that folklore painted as natural enemies. "The truth I've carried for 300 years," he said quietly, his ancient voice breaking with emotion that had been held in check since Elena Martinez's last breath, "is that your great-aunt died not from vampire violence, but from the biological impossibility of what we created together." Half-vampire pregnancies are incredibly rare, occurring perhaps once in a millennium, when love transcends species boundaries and creates life that challenges fundamental laws of supernatural genetics. Her human physiology couldn't sustain a child whose vampire heritage accelerated development beyond mortal limitations, whose very existence required more than human blood and bones could provide. I held Elena in my arms as she died, bringing our daughter into the world, watched her fade like candlelight in wind, while she made me promise that Lydia would have the human life she'd never be able to give her. Elena Reyes felt certainty crumble like foundations undermined by water and time, as Alexander's story aligned with family legends that had been passed down through generations with details that couldn't be fabricated or researched in hunter databases. Her great-grandmother Maria's version of events had emphasized seduction and murder because the truth of consensual love between species was more threatening to human supremacist ideology than simple predation, which could be fought with weapons and strategy rather than empathy and understanding. The hunter's encrypted phone buzzed with final warnings from command as strike teams moved into position around the warehouse district, Commander Cross's voice crackling through speakers with tactical updates that treated Elena as potential hostile for failure to withdraw from combat zone before operations commenced. The choice she faced transcended professional duty and personal loyalty, demanding she decide whether family meant blood relation or organizational allegiance, whether justice required vengeance for ancient wrongs or protection of innocent lives, caught between forces too powerful for individual resistance. Jake Hendricks and his crew had narrowed their search to the warehouse district through systematic intimidation of homeless populations who'd seen expensive cars in areas where luxury vehicles meant either police raids or criminal meetings that honest people avoided by instinct and experience. Marcus rode in the passenger seat of his brother's pickup truck, his concussed brain spinning fantasies about dragging Lydia home and locking her in her room until her 21st birthday arrived, and secured his financial future through legal arrangements that had seemed ironclad when he'd married her mother for insurance money rather than love. The gang's weapons gleamed under streetlights as they prepared to storm buildings where they believed their target was hiding, ready to use violence that had served them well in previous operations against rivals and debtors who'd thought geography or connections could protect them from consequences of crossing Jake Hendricks and his crew. The warehouse district stretched across Denver's industrial belly like a concrete graveyard where honest work had died decades ago, its abandoned buildings providing perfect cover for the convergence of forces that would determine whether supernatural secrecy survived another century. Elena Reyes crouched behind a rusted shipping container, her hunter's gear arrayed with military precision while she tracked multiple threats through night vision scopes that revealed more than human eyes could process. Marcus Hendricks and his brother Jake had recruited 6 gang members armed with stolen weapons and fueled by methamphetamine courage, their search for Lydia driven by greed and wounded pride that made them dangerous in ways they couldn't comprehend. Simultaneously, Elena's hunter network had deployed a strike team from Colorado Springs, elite operatives trained specifically to eliminate vampire royalty, using weapons blessed by Vatican archivists and forged from metals that had drunk the blood of saints. The irony wasn't lost on her that she found herself protecting the very creatures her family had sworn to destroy. But blood called to blood across generations, and Lydia's innocence had awakened protective instincts that transcended professional duty. Alexander moved through shadows with centuries of predatory grace, his supernatural senses mapping enemy positions while calculating odds that would have discouraged lesser beings from attempting rescue operations. His daughter needed time to process revelations that had shattered her worldview, but time was a luxury they couldn't afford when human criminals and vampire hunters converged on their location with lethal intent. The abandoned diner where Lydia worked had become ground zero for a conflict that could expose supernatural existence to human authorities ill-equipped to handle such knowledge, its neon sign flickering like a dying heartbeat against windows that had witnessed too many desperate last stands. Lydia huddled in the diner's kitchen while her vampire abilities surged beyond her control, stress triggering manifestations of power that she didn't understand and couldn't direct safely. Every sound seemed amplified to painful intensity. Every scent carried information that overwhelmed her human consciousness, and strength flowed through her limbs like electrical current seeking ground. She could hear Marcus's voice outside, slurred with alcohol, but sharp with the kind of rage that turned domestic violence into homicide when witnesses became inconvenient. He'd brought reinforcements this time, men whose criminal records included assault charges and weapons violations, whose loyalty could be bought with promises of easy money from a stepdaughter's inheritance fund. Elena made her choice with the decisive authority that 4 generations of hunter training had burned into her DNA, abandoning her surveillance position to approach Alexander with an offer that violated every principle she'd been raised to honor. "I can get you both out of Denver alive," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the distance between them through hunter communication systems that bypassed normal audio channels. "But this is a one-time offer based on family obligation, not professional approval of what you represent. You never return to American hunting territories, and you take that girl somewhere she can learn control before she accidentally kills someone who doesn't deserve it." The Vampire King nodded acceptance of terms that amounted to permanent exile from a continent he'd helped shape through centuries of careful political manipulation, his ancient pride bowing to paternal love that had awakened after 3 centuries of dormancy. "Agreed," he replied through supernatural communication that carried thoughts rather than words. "But first, we must extract Lydia from a situation that grows more dangerous with each passing moment. And that will require cooperation between natural enemies, who have excellent reasons to distrust each other's motives." Marcus and his gang breached the diner's front entrance, with the subtle grace of bulldozers destroying a flower garden, their weapons drawn, and their intentions broadcast through body language that spoke of violence barely held in check. The leader of this amateur army was driven by more than greed now, his masculine pride wounded by a 19-year-old girl who'd thrown him across a parking lot with supernatural strength he couldn't explain or accept. Jake Hendricks possessed the kind of criminal intelligence that made him dangerous despite his brother's obvious stupidity. Recognizing that Lydia represented either valuable commodity or threat that needed elimination before police investigations grew too thorough, the gang members spread through the diner with tactical awareness gleaned from video games and prison experience, their movements revealing just enough competence to create real danger when combined with weapons that could kill regardless of the operator's skill level. Lydia heard them coming through enhanced senses that painted sound in colors she'd never experienced, mapping their positions with accuracy that would have impressed military professionals. Terror and supernatural and instinct warred in her consciousness, as vampire heritage demanded she defend herself, while human conscience recoiled from the violence that seemed inevitable. She'd never hurt anyone intentionally in her entire life, had absorbed Marcus's abuse without retaliation for 5 years, but now power flowed through her body like molten metal seeking shape in a forge heated beyond safe parameters. When Marcus kicked open the kitchen door with his gun raised and his face twisted by alcohol and rage, Lydia's vampire reflexes took control without consulting her conscious mind for permission. She moved faster than human perception could follow, disarming him with casual ease, while her newfound strength sent him crashing into industrial refrigeration equipment that dented under impact, forces no human body should have been able to generate. But Jake had positioned himself in the dining area with clear lines of sight, and when his brother's scream echoed through the building, he opened fire with an assault rifle that had been modified for fully automatic operation. Bullets shredded the kitchen's thin walls, while Lydia dove behind a prep counter that offered minimal protection from military-grade ammunition. Her enhanced hearing picking up the subtle differences between rounds that would merely wound and those that would kill on contact. Elena burst through the diner's rear entrance with hunter precision that turned tactical disadvantage into strategic opportunity, her weapons systems engaging multiple targets while she calculated firing solutions that would neutralize threats without hitting innocent bystanders. The gang members had made the classic mistake of assuming superior numbers guaranteed victory, forgetting that professional operators trained specifically for supernatural combat possessed advantages that criminal experience couldn't match. Alexander appeared in the dining room like death given elegant form, his vampire speed making him essentially invisible to human reflexes, while his centuries of combat experience guided movements that were simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. He disarmed Jake Hendricks with surgical precision, his supernatural strength crushing bones that would heal crooked, even with medical intervention. The remaining gang members found themselves facing an opponent who moved like liquid shadow and struck with force that defied every law of physics they thought they understood. But in the chaos of supernatural combat and human desperation, tragedy struck with the inevitability of avalanche or earthquake. Sally Morrison, a 63-year-old grandmother who cleaned the diner's restrooms for minimum wage, had hidden in a supply closet when the shooting started, her arthritic hands pressed against her mouth to muffle terrified breathing. When Lydia's vampire strength sent a gang member flying across the dining room, his trajectory carried him directly into the closet door with enough force to splinter wood and shatter the elderly woman's hip in 3 places. Sally's scream of pain cut through Lydia's consciousness like silver blade through exposed nerve, the sound carrying guilt and horror that would haunt her dreams for decades. She knelt beside the injured woman while sirens wailed in the distance, her hands shaking as she applied pressure to wounds that her own actions had caused indirectly but inevitably. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as Sally's blood stained her fingers with proof of power's terrible responsibility. "I never meant for this to happen. I didn't know how strong I was becoming." Elena finished securing the unconscious gang members with zip ties that would hold until police arrived, her hunter training automatically cataloging evidence that might expose supernatural involvement, while her conscience grappled with complicity in violence that had escalated beyond anyone's control. The elderly woman needed immediate medical attention, and human authorities would ask questions that couldn't be answered without revealing truths that would shatter the careful balance between species that had maintained peace for centuries. Alexander lifted his daughter gently, while Elena called emergency services with carefully crafted lies about gang violence and random criminality, their story coordinated to protect supernatural secrecy, while ensuring Sally Morrison received treatment that might save her life. They escaped through Denver's industrial maze as police flooded the scene with bureaucratic efficiency that would complicate their situation exponentially if any evidence pointed toward supernatural involvement. The Vampire King's private jet waited at a secondary airfield where Victor paced with barely controlled agitation, his ancient features reflecting political pressures that had been building across an ocean while his master pursued personal obligations in hostile territory. "My lord," Victor said, as they boarded the aircraft, his voice carrying centuries of loyal service, strained by circumstances that threatened everything they'd built together. "The European Council demands your immediate return. Your absence has created power vacuum that lesser lords are exploiting for territorial expansion. The Romanian Coven has declared independence from your authority, and the Hungarian vampires threaten alliance with werewolf packs that have never accepted supernatural treaties. If you don't reassert control within 48 hours, civil war becomes inevitable. Alexander settled into his seat while processing political intelligence that confirmed his worst fears about abandoning responsibilities that affected thousands of supernatural beings across multiple species. Kings who chose personal happiness over duty rarely kept their thrones long, and vampire politics had always been conducted through violence that made human warfare seem civilized by comparison. His lieutenant's report painted a clear picture: return immediately to maintain order, or watch 8 centuries of careful diplomacy collapse into chaos that would expose all supernatural species to human persecution. Lydia sat beside her father with guilt weighing on her soul, like stones sewn into a burial shroud. Sally Morrison's blood still under her fingernails, despite repeated washing. The elderly woman's screams echoed in her enhanced hearing, while her conscience catalogued every choice that had led to innocent suffering caused by power she neither wanted nor controlled adequately. Elena occupied a seat across the aisle, her hunter instincts warring with family loyalty, as she processed intelligence suggesting that vampire royalty operated under political pressures more complex than simple predation or territorial expansion. Victor continued his briefing with clinical precision that made ancient conflicts sound like quarterly business reports. But Lydia heard undertones of genuine affection for the vampire king, who'd apparently inspired loyalty through leadership rather than fear alone. "The council has given you final ultimatum, my lord," Victor concluded with obvious reluctance. "Return to claim your throne and restore order to territories that depend on your authority, or be declared rogue king with no protection from vampire law. They will not tolerate abandonment of duty, even for family reunification that was 3 centuries overdue. Lesser vampires are already questioning your fitness to rule if personal concerns can override responsibilities to your subjects." Alexander closed his eyes and felt the weight of 800 years pressing down on him like ocean depths. Every decision he'd made as king balanced against the daughter he'd found after believing her dead for 3 centuries. Vampire law was absolute in its logic. Rulers who prioritized personal desires over subject welfare forfeited legitimacy and protection, becoming targets for ambitious subordinates who would kill them to claim power. But he'd already lost Lydia once through duty to supernatural politics, and the thought of losing her again made his dead heart perform impossible arithmetic of pain. Lydia watched her father struggle with choices that had no perfect solutions, recognizing in his expression the same trapped desperation she'd felt for years under Marcus's control. "Send me somewhere safe," she said quietly, her voice carrying new maturity, born from witnessing violence and understanding power's terrible burden. "Go back to your kingdom and fulfill the duties that thousands of people depend on you to perform. I've survived 19 years without knowing who you were, and I can survive longer if it means preventing war that would hurt innocent supernatural beings who never chose to be part of our family drama." But Alexander had spent 3 centuries regretting choices made in haste and duty's name, watching love slip away while he honored obligations that felt increasingly hollow with each passing year. "Not again," he said with quiet finality that carried absolute determination. "I won't lose you again to politics and fear and the cowardice that masquerades as responsible leadership. If the council wants my throne, they can take it by force, but they won't separate me from my daughter through ultimatums designed to exploit love as weakness rather than strength." Lydia studied her father's face and saw reflection of her own stubborn will, the same refusal to accept defeat that had carried her through years of abuse without breaking completely. "If you're willing to sacrifice a kingdom for family," she said slowly, "then maybe I should be willing to learn what it means to be worthy of such sacrifice. I'll come with you to your mountain fortress, not as helpless daughter hiding from the world, but as your heir learning to wield power responsibly enough to help rule supernatural subjects who deserve leaders who understand both duty and love." Marcus Hendricks stumbled through the corridors of Jefferson High School with the desperate fury of a cornered animal, his concussed brain spinning fantasies of control while reality crumbled around him like sand castles in hurricane surf. The security guard lay unconscious by the main entrance where Marcus had struck him with a tire iron retrieved from his brother's pickup truck, blood pooling beneath gray hair while morning sunlight streamed through windows that would soon frame tragedy or triumph depending on choices yet unmade. His financial desperation had metastasized into homicidal rage during the sleepless nights since Lydia's disappearance, alcohol and methamphetamine, combining with head trauma to create a psychological cocktail that transformed petty domestic violence into something far more dangerous. The insurance money that funded his gambling addiction would disappear forever when Lydia turned 21 in 6 weeks, leaving him homeless and destitute unless he regained control over the girl who'd somehow developed supernatural strength that defied every law of physics he thought he understood. Jake's gang had scattered after the diner incident, when police investigations grew too thorough for comfort, abandoning their leader's brother to pursue vengeance alone with weapons stolen from evidence lockers and courage borrowed from crystal methamphetamine that made paranoid delusions seem like tactical brilliance. The high school represented Marcus's last desperate gambit, a public stage where Lydia's compassion for innocent classmates would force her into the open regardless of whatever supernatural protection she'd acquired from mysterious allies. He herded 37 students and 2 teachers into the gymnasium with theatrical threats and genuine willingness to shed blood, his assault rifle providing authority that his personality had never possessed naturally. Television news crews gathered outside, while police negotiators established communication protocols designed for hostage situations that didn't involve supernatural complications or family secrets that predated American independence by several centuries. Lydia felt the crisis developing through vampire senses that painted fear in colors she was still learning to interpret. Marcus's psychic signature blazing with desperate madness, while innocent students radiated terror that made her newly awakened empathy feel like exposed nerve endings. She sat in Alexander's private jet at Denver International Airport, her father and Elena coordinating response strategies through encrypted communications that bypassed normal law enforcement channels to prevent supernatural exposure. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her like ocean depths as she realized that her choices in the next few hours would determine whether her stepfather became mass murderer or simply another statistic in domestic violence databases that already contained too many preventable tragedies. Elena monitored police radio frequencies while calculating tactical options that balanced human safety against supernatural secrecy, her hunter training providing expertise in crisis management that law enforcement agencies couldn't match when dealing with situations that transcended normal criminal psychology. She'd contacted sympathetic officials within Denver's police department, career professionals who'd encountered enough unexplained incidents to accept help from federal consultants without asking uncomfortable questions about credentials or jurisdiction. Detective James Morrison, Sally Morrison's nephew, had agreed to coordinate with Elena after learning about his aunt's hospitalization and the circumstances surrounding her injuries. His family connection creating personal investment in ensuring justice rather than simply closing case files with bureaucratic efficiency. Alexander prepared for direct intervention with centuries of combat experience focused through paternal love that had awakened protective instincts dormant since Elena Martinez's death 300 years earlier. His vampire abilities would allow him to neutralize Marcus without lethal force, but only if he could reach the gymnasium without exposing supernatural existence to media scrutiny that would shatter carefully maintained secrecy agreements between species. The mountain fortress in Romania seemed like different universe as he contemplated risking everything he'd built through 8 centuries of political maneuvering for the chance to save one damaged human who'd never shown his daughter anything but cruelty and exploitation. Victor coordinated evacuation procedures for supernatural assets throughout North America while monitoring European intelligence that suggested vampire civil war was hours rather than days away from erupting across multiple territories. His loyalty to Alexander transcended political calculation, but his responsibility to their species demanded that he prepare contingency plans for leadership transition if the Vampire King failed to return before lesser lords consolidated enough power to challenge royal authority permanently. The jet's communication systems crackled with updates from Romanian intelligence networks, Hungarian werewolf pack leaders, and Vatican liaisons who maintained supernatural treaties that most humans never knew existed. Police established perimeter around Jefferson High School with tactical precision that impressed Elena despite her professional experience with law enforcement agencies across 3 continents. Their movements revealing training that went beyond standard hostage protocols to include procedures designed for situations involving weapons of mass destruction or terrorist cells with international connections. Detective Morrison briefed his team on consultant recommendations while carefully avoiding details that would raise questions about Elena's actual credentials or the nature of threats they might encounter, beyond desperate stepfather with obvious mental health issues and access to military-grade weapons. The gymnasium's windows had been covered with paper from art classes, transforming the space into fortress where Marcus paced with manic energy while his hostages huddled against bleachers like sheep awaiting slaughter. His demands were simple, but impossible. Lydia must surrender herself to his custody within 3 hours, or he would begin executing students alphabetically starting with Amy Anderson, a cheerleader whose only crime was alphabetical priority in attendance rosters. Television helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, while social media exploded with hashtags and theories that ranged from domestic terrorism to cult recruitment, none approaching the supernatural truth that would have been dismissed as fantasy even if revealed completely. Lydia made her decision with quiet determination that surprised adults who'd known her as Marcus's timid victim rather than Alexander's fierce daughter, her vampire heritage providing courage while human compassion demanded she risk everything to protect innocent lives. "I'm going in alone," she announced, her voice carrying authority that hadn't existed a week earlier when she'd been serving coffee to customers who saw only another struggling teenager with bruises hidden beneath makeup and long sleeves. "If Marcus wants me, then he can have me. But I won't let him hurt people who never did anything to deserve being caught in our family's dysfunction." Alexander's paternal instincts rebelled against allowing his daughter to face danger alone, but strategic analysis confirmed that her plan offered the best chance for successful resolution without supernatural exposure that would doom both their species to persecution or extinction. Her vampire abilities were untrained but powerful enough to survive Marcus's violence, while her human appearance would prevent police from questioning why teenage girl could overpower armed adult male without sustaining significant injury. Elena would coordinate with law enforcement to ensure tactical support, while Alexander provided supernatural backup from positions that media cameras couldn't detect or record for later analysis by government agencies with uncomfortable questions about unexplained phenomena. The gymnasium's emergency exit had been chained shut from inside, while Marcus positioned himself with clear sightlines to all entrances, his assault rifle loaded with ammunition designed to penetrate body armor that his paranoid imagination assumed police tactical teams would be wearing. He'd consumed enough methamphetamine to keep him alert for days, while alcohol provided liquid courage that transformed cowardice into reckless aggression, his chemical cocktail ensuring that negotiation would be impossible without overwhelming show of force that could result in mass casualties. Television news anchors provided running commentary on family dysfunction and gun violence, while social workers debated domestic abuse patterns that had obviously escalated beyond normal intervention protocols, none recognizing that supernatural forces were converging on suburban high school like opposing armies meeting on battlefield chosen by madman with nothing left to lose. Lydia walked through the school's main entrance with vampire senses mapping Marcus's location, while her enhanced hearing picked up whispered prayers from hostages, who'd been reduced to hoping for divine intervention since human authorities seemed powerless to resolve the crisis without bloodshed. She moved through familiar hallways where she'd walked for 4 years, past lockers and classrooms that held memories of teenage normalcy, now forever altered by revelation of her true nature and family heritage that connected her to centuries of supernatural politics and ancient blood feuds. The gymnasium doors had been barricaded with weight equipment that would have required multiple adults to move under normal circumstances, but Marcus's methamphetamine-fueled strength had accomplished the task alone, while his hostages watched in terrified silence. Lydia's vampire abilities allowed her to hear his heartbeat racing with chemical stimulation, smell his fear beneath chemical bravado, and sense the psychological fragmentation that made him dangerous in ways that transcended physical violence, to include complete disconnection from moral restraints that normally prevented ordinary people from committing atrocities. She knocked on the gymnasium doors with deliberate calm that belied the supernatural speed flowing through her nervous system like electricity seeking ground, her voice carrying across the space between them, with authority she'd never possessed during 5 years of absorbing his abuse without retaliation. "Marcus," she called, her words echoing in the enclosed space where 37 innocent lives hung in balance, determined by choices made by people who'd never asked to become part of supernatural drama that had been unfolding across centuries. "I'm here alone and unarmed. Just like you demanded. Let the students go, and we can settle our family business without involving people who never did anything to hurt you." Marcus laughed with sound that contained no humor, only bitter recognition of irony that had brought his stepdaughter back into his power when she could have disappeared forever with mysterious allies who'd helped her develop impossible strength and confidence that threatened everything he'd built through systematic intimidation and financial exploitation. The insurance money represented his only chance for financial security, and Lydia's upcoming 21st birthday meant permanent loss of control unless he could force her signature on documents that would extend his guardianship beyond legal majority through conservatorship arrangements that portrayed her as mentally incompetent rather than supernaturally awakened. "You think you can walk in here and give me orders like you're in charge now," he shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria that had been building for days while reality refused to conform to his alcohol-soaked expectations. "You're nothing but a stupid little girl who got lucky once in a parking lot, and now you're going to learn what happens when you try to steal money that belongs to me by right of marriage to your dead mother, who was too weak to live long enough to see what her precious daughter became." Lydia felt vampire rage surge through her consciousness like molten metal seeking shape, her supernatural heritage demanding violent response to threats against her human family, while centuries of predatory instinct whispered that Marcus deserved death for his years of abuse and current willingness to harm innocent children. But Elena Martinez's compassion lived in her daughter's heart, alongside Alexander's ancient fury, human mercy tempering vampire justice to create something new and potentially more dangerous than either species had produced alone. She pushed through the barricaded doors with casual display of strength that sent weight equipment sliding across polished floors like toys scattered by giant child, her vampire abilities allowing her to move faster than Marcus's chemical-enhanced reflexes could track accurately. His assault rifle barked fire that shattered windows and splintered bleacher seats while bullets passed through space where she'd been standing milliseconds earlier, her supernatural speed making her essentially invisible to human perception during brief intervals between muzzle flashes. Elena coordinated tactical response through encrypted communications, while police snipers established sightlines that would allow clean shots if supernatural intervention failed to neutralize the threat before innocent lives were lost to domestic violence that had escalated beyond traditional law enforcement capabilities. Detective Morrison positioned his team with professional competence, while hoping that federal consultants knew something about hostage psychology that his 20 years of experience hadn't taught him yet. Alexander materialized in the gymnasium like death given elegant form, his vampire speed allowing him to disarm Marcus without killing him, despite every instinct demanding permanent solution to threat against his daughter and innocent humans caught in crossfire of family dysfunction that had festered for decades. His supernatural strength crushed bones that would heal eventually, while his compulsion abilities scrambled Marcus's already fragmented consciousness, leaving the man conscious but docile enough for arrest and prosecution that would remove him permanently from Lydia's life. Lydia knelt beside her stepfather, while police sirens wailed outside and television helicopters captured footage that would be analyzed for years without revealing supernatural truth that explained how teenage girl had survived assault rifle fire without injury. Marcus lay crumpled against gymnasium wall with multiple fractures, but no life-threatening injuries, his breathing shallow but steady, while paramedics prepared him for transport to medical facilities where psychiatric evaluation would determine his fitness for trial on charges ranging from kidnapping to attempted murder. She could have killed him easily, with vampire strength that rendered human resistance meaningless, could have claimed justified self-defense while ending 5 years of abuse with single blow that would crush his skull like eggshell. Instead, she applied pressure to wounds that were bleeding too heavily, her hands steady, despite psychological trauma that would have shattered weaker spirits into irreparable fragments. Elena processed evidence that would ensure Marcus faced maximum penalties for crimes that included financial exploitation of minor dependents, domestic violence documented through photographs of injuries, and today's hostage situation that had terrorized entire community while threatening multiple innocent lives. Detective Morrison coordinated with federal prosecutors who specialized in cases involving interstate commerce violations and weapons charges that would guarantee lengthy prison sentence, even if other charges were reduced through plea negotiations designed to avoid prolonged trials that might expose uncomfortable details about supernatural involvement in resolution. The students filed out of the gymnasium, with expressions ranging from relief to confusion, their teenage minds struggling to process how their classmate had walked into armed confrontation and emerged unharmed while their captor lay unconscious with injuries that suggested professional military intervention, rather than high school girl with hidden strength. Lydia's best friend Sarah wrapped her in fierce hug while asking questions that couldn't be answered honestly, without revealing truths that would endanger both human and vampire worlds through exposure that neither species was prepared to handle. Media attention focused on domestic violence and gun control while missing supernatural elements that had actually determined the outcome. Their coverage, painting traditional narrative of troubled family and heroic law enforcement, rather than centuries-old vampire royalty protecting half-human daughter from abusive stepfather whose greed had led to mass hostage situation. Alexander watched his daughter interact with human friends and authority figures while calculating political costs of today's intervention, his actions having delayed but not prevented the civil war brewing in European territories, where lesser vampire lords interpreted his absence as weakness that could be exploited for territorial expansion. Victor's reports grew increasingly urgent as Romanian covens declared independence, while Hungarian vampires negotiated alliances with werewolf packs that had never fully accepted supernatural peace treaties, their combined forces potentially strong enough to challenge royal authority if coordinated properly by ambitious leaders who understood that power vacuums never remained empty long in supernatural politics. Lydia made her decision while watching paramedics load Marcus into ambulance that would carry him toward justice. She'd been too young and powerless to demand during 5 years of systematic abuse, her choice reflecting understanding of responsibility that came with power, whether vampire or human in origin. "I want to come with you to Romania," she told her father quietly, while Elena coordinated with law enforcement officials who would ensure that today's events were recorded accurately enough to prevent future legal complications. "Not because I'm running away from human world that raised me, but because I need to learn how to be worthy of the sacrifice you made by choosing family over kingdom when duty should have demanded otherwise." Sarah hugged her again with tears streaming down both their faces, while Lydia promised to return for graduation ceremony that would mark transition between childhood and whatever adulthood meant for someone caught between two worlds that had never been meant to coexist peacefully. Elena resigned from Hunter organization that had defined her family's purpose for 4 generations. Her decision to become liaison between supernatural beings and human authorities, representing evolution rather than betrayal of values that had motivated centuries of warfare between species. Her aunt's death had been tragedy rather than murder, love rather than predation, and continuing blood feud would dishonor Elena Martinez's memory while preventing cooperation that might protect both humans and vampires from threats that neither could face alone successfully. The private jet lifted off from Denver International Airport as sunset painted Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Lydia of home she was leaving behind temporarily but not abandoning permanently. Her reflection visible in aircraft windows like ghost, caught between worlds she was learning to navigate with grace. Inherited from both parents. Alexander watched his daughter study ancient vampire law texts while maintaining video connection with human friends through technology that bridged distances and differences with casual efficiency that amazed someone whose early centuries had required months to cross oceans that modern aircraft conquered in hours. She belonged to both worlds completely rather than partially, her existence proof that love could transcend species boundaries when courage and compassion guided choices that others made through fear and prejudice alone. The Carpathian Mountains rose ahead like ancient guardians protecting secrets that predated human civilization, their peaks crowned with snow that reflected starlight like scattered diamonds, while castle towers pierced clouds that had witnessed 8 centuries of vampire politics and supernatural diplomacy. Lydia would learn to wield power responsibly through training that honored both her human conscience and vampire heritage, becoming bridge between species rather than weapon for either side in conflicts that had consumed too many innocent lives already. Her reflection in airplane window showed faint but present image symbolizing existence between two worlds where she belonged fully to both. Her future bright with possibilities that neither human nor vampire alone could have achieved through individual effort. Victor awaited their arrival with political intelligence that would determine whether royal authority could be restored before civil war destroyed everything they'd built through centuries of careful negotiation. But Alexander felt confident that his daughter would help him become better leader than duty alone had ever made him. Someone who understood that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them through fear or force.